The COVID origin question was never settled. Fauci's diary shows officials knew that from the start. Fauci privately doubted the Wuhan market story in January 2020. So why did the truth take 6 years? Newly released entries from Anthony Fauci's pandemic diary expose something deeply troubling. Not proof that COVID-19 came from a laboratory, but proof that the uncertainty behind closed doors was far greater than the confidence presented to the public. On January 26, 2020, while the world was only beginning to understand the threat emerging from Wuhan, Fauci recorded a striking conclusion. The Huanan seafood market was not the source of the outbreak, but an amplifier. He nevertheless believed that the virus had jumped from animals into humans somewhere before spreading through the market. Roughly a week later, his diary described a private conference call during which several leading scientists considered whether the virus might not have originated naturally. Those entries do not establish that SARS-CoV-2 escaped from a laboratory. They do, however, destroy the simpler version of history in which serious officials immediately knew that the market was the origin, regarded alternative explanations as scientifically absurd, and only revisited them after political pressure. The private record shows that the doubts existed from the beginning. That is why the release matters. The scandal is not that Fauci possessed a secret answer to the pandemic's origin. There is no evidence that he did. The scandal is that legitimate uncertainty was frequently compressed into public certainty, while people asking questions about Wuhan's laboratories were too often treated as cranks, propagandists, or conspiracy theorists. What Fauci's diary actually proves. The strongest claim supported by the diary is narrower than some headlines suggest. Fauci did not write that COVID-19 definitely originated in a laboratory. His January entry reportedly said the market was an amplifier, rather than the original source, while maintaining that the virus had crossed from an animal into a human somewhere else. Scientists who favor natural spillover can hold precisely that position. An animal infection may have occurred before the recognized market outbreak, with the market then accelerating transmission. Yet the diary also records that senior scientists were considering laboratory-related explanations almost immediately. Fauci described a discussion in which some participants believed unusual features of the virus warranted investigation, while others argued that those features could arise naturally. That distinction is critical. The diary does not prove that SARS-CoV-2 was engineered, that it was a biological weapon, that Fauci knew it had escaped from the Wuhan Institute of Virology, or that the Huanan market played no important role in the outbreak. It does prove that the origin question was unsettled privately at a time when the public debate was rapidly becoming moralized and politicized. By May 2020, Fauci was publicly citing genomic evidence against the proposition that the virus had been artificially created or deliberately manipulated. That scientific point was often blurred into a broader dismissal of laboratory origin itself. Despite those being different propositions, a naturally occurring virus could theoretically have infected a researcher during field sampling or laboratory work without ever having been genetically engineered. The public conversation repeatedly failed to maintain that distinction. Why has it taken so long? There is no single explanation. Several forces overlapped. First came the chaos of an emerging pandemic. Governments were trying to understand an unfamiliar virus, while hospitals filled, borders closed, and incomplete information traveled faster than verified evidence. Early mistakes were inevitable, but uncertainty alone does not explain 6 years of delay. The second factor was China's refusal to provide the level of access required for a definitive investigation. The World Health Organization says China still has not supplied hundreds of early patient sequences, detailed information about animals sold in Wuhan markets, or sufficient records concerning research and biosafety conditions at Wuhan laboratories. The HO's independent expert group concluded in 2025 that the investigation remained unfinished. The third factor was political contamination. Donald Trump and members of his administration promoted a possible Wuhan laboratory connection while simultaneously making unsupported or inflammatory claims about China that allowed critics to treat the entire subject as an extension of Trumpism rather than separating weak rhetoric from a legitimate investigative question. The fourth factor was institutional self-protection. The United States had funded coronavirus research involving EcoHealth Alliance and Chinese scientific partners. That does not establish any connection to the pandemic virus, but it created obvious reputational and political sensitivities. Officials responsible for research policy had an incentive to avoid public speculation that could implicate programs they had supported, even indirectly. Scientists faced similar pressures. A laboratory accident involving coronavirus research could trigger restrictions, damage international collaboration, and jeopardize funding across an entire field. Conversely, scientists who publicly promoted a lab origin without direct evidence risked fueling anti-Asian hostility and attacks on researchers. These concerns were not imaginary, but they created an environment in which protecting science from political misuse could slide into protecting scientific institutions from scrutiny. The fifth factor was media conformity. Once influential scientific voices and institutions leaned towards natural spillover, the cost of questioning that view increased. Social media companies moderated some lab leak claims, news organizations used the language of debunking, and legitimate questions were frequently grouped together with claims that the virus was an intentionally released Chinese bioweapon. That category error mattered. Laboratory-associated incident covers several possible events, from infection during wildlife sampling to accidental exposure to a naturally collected virus. It is not synonymous with deliberate engineering or intentional release. The result was a false binary. Accept the market narrative or join the conspiracy theorists. Where did COVID-19 most likely originate? The honest answer remains unsatisfying, Wuhan. Probably through either zoonotic spillover connected to the wildlife trade or laboratory-associated incident, but the available evidence still does not identify the precise event. The strongest published scientific case favors natural spillover. Early known cases clustered geographically around the Huanan market. Environmental samples from parts of the market where susceptible live mammals were sold tested positive for SARS-CoV-2, alongside genetic material from animals, including raccoon dogs. Studies have also argued that the earliest viral lineages are consistent with more than one animal-to-human introduction. The W2025 Scientific Advisory Group for the Origins of Novel Pathogens concluded that the weight of available evidence suggests zoonotic transmission, either directly from bats or through an intermediate animal host. It found no compelling evidence that SARS-CoV-2 was deliberately engineered. But the case is incomplete. No animal infected with the immediate progenitor of SARS-CoV-2 has been identified. No definitive wildlife supply chain has been reconstructed. No direct ancestor virus has been found. The market may have been the location of spillover, an early super-spreading environment, or both. The laboratory hypothesis also rests largely on circumstantial evidence. Wuhan housed one of the world's foremost centers for bat coronavirus research. Researchers collected viruses from distant caves, conducted experiments on related coronaviruses, and worked under conditions that critics have argued created accident risks. Intelligence agencies have consequently reached different conclusions. The Federal Bureau of Investigation has favored a laboratory-associated origin with moderate confidence. The Central Intelligence Agency later assessed a laboratory origin as more likely, but only with low confidence. Other U.S. intelligence bodies have favored natural exposure or remained undecided. Low confidence is not a bureaucratic way of saying secretly certain. It means the evidence is fragmentary, unreliable, or open to competing interpretations. The best current judgment is therefore not that the lab leak has been proved. It is that it was never reasonable to declare it impossible. The distinction that changes the entire debate. Much of the argument has been distorted by collapsing four very different propositions into one. The virus arose naturally in wildlife and spilled directly into humans. A naturally occurring virus infected someone during field sampling or laboratory activity. A virus was altered during legitimate research and escaped accidentally. A biological weapon was deliberately created and released. Evidence against the fourth proposition does not disprove the second or third. The U.S. intelligence community has broadly agreed that SARS-CoV-2 was not developed as a biological weapon. Most agencies have also assessed, though often with limited confidence, that it was probably not genetically engineered. At the same time, intelligence analysts have continued to regard both natural exposure and a laboratory-associated incident as plausible. Public messaging rarely preserved those layers. A person asking whether a researcher might have been infected while collecting bat samples could be treated as though they had alleged a deliberate bioweapon attack. That was scientifically careless and politically convenient. Why the delay deserves outrage. Outrage is justified, but it should be aimed precisely. It is not justified because Fauci's diary proves he caused the pandemic, engineered a virus, or knowingly concealed a confirmed laboratory accident. None of that has been established. It is justified because institutions repeatedly communicated a degree of certainty they did not possess. It is justified because genuine scientific disagreements were sometimes hidden behind a polished public consensus. It is justified because individuals who raised a plausible hypothesis were often stigmatized before the evidence had been properly investigated. It is justified because China's obstruction has prevented the world from learning lessons that could stop another pandemic. And it is justified because the release of important records has repeatedly depended on subpoenas, investigations, leaks, declassification, and political warfare, rather than proactive transparency. Fauci's diary is especially damaging because it captures the gap in real time. Privately, officials were wrestling with competing explanations. Publicly, the space for doubt rapidly narrowed. That does not necessarily demonstrate a centrally organized cover-up. Institutional failures rarely require one. Shared incentives can produce the same result: reputational fear, political tribalism, funding concerns, career protection, media conformity, and the belief that public uncertainty would be dangerous. Each participant may believe they are preventing misinformation. Together, they can create it. Conspiracies that turned out to be real. The phrase conspiracy theory is often used too loosely. A theory does not become true merely because one element later proves correct, and countless conspiracy claims remain false. Nevertheless, history contains documented cases in which institutions denied, concealed, or minimized conduct that initially sounded implausible. The Central Intelligence Agency's MKUltra program funded experiments involving psychoactive drugs, behavior manipulation, and covert testing on unwitting people. Senate investigations later confirmed that the program involved scores of sub-projects and ethically indefensible human experimentation. The Federal Bureau of Investigation's COINTELPRO operations infiltrated, monitored, and disrupted political organizations and civil rights movements. The FBI now publicly maintains records describing the program it began in 1956. The Tuskegee syphilis study deceived Black American participants and withheld adequate treatment, even after penicillin became available. The experiment lasted until 1972, and President Bill Clinton formally apologized on behalf of the United States government in 1997. The second reported Gulf of Tonkin attack, used to help justify the dramatic escalation of the Vietnam War, was later assessed by the National Security Agency not to have occurred. Contemporary doubts were not properly conveyed, as the administration sought congressional authority. The FBI, CIA, and other U.S. agencies also conducted domestic surveillance and intelligence abuses on a scale that was once denied or hidden. The Senate's Church Committee eventually documented operations involving unlawful surveillance, disruption, and covert interference. These cases do not prove every modern suspicion. They prove something more limited and more important. Institutions are capable of deception, particularly when national security, political power, money, or reputation is at stake. The correct response is not blanket belief. It is relentless demands for evidence. What is still unknown? Almost every decisive fact about the opening weeks of the pandemic remains missing or disputed. We still do not know the identity of the first infected person, We do not know the exact date or location of the first human infection. We do not know whether the Huanan market hosted the original animal-to-human transmission or merely amplified an outbreak that had already begun elsewhere. We do not know which animal species, if any, carried the immediate ancestor of SARS-CoV-2. We do not know whether a Wuhan laboratory possessed an unpublished virus substantially closer to SARS-CoV-2 than those now publicly known. We do not have full access to laboratory databases, employee health records, biosafety logs, wildlife sampling records, or complete early patient data. We do not know whether every relevant US and Chinese research communication has been preserved and disclosed. We also do not know whether the missing evidence still exists. The US intelligence community warned years ago that a definitive conclusion might require either identifying the precise animal pathway or establishing that a Wuhan laboratory possessed SARS-CoV-2 or a sufficiently close progenitor before the outbreak. Neither threshold has been met. The lesson is bigger than Fauci. The most important question is no longer whether Anthony Fauci was personally right or wrong in January 2020. It is whether the institutions responsible for guiding the public can distinguish between protecting people from misinformation and protecting themselves from uncomfortable scrutiny. The diary reveals that uncertainty was present at the top from the opening weeks. That uncertainty should have been communicated honestly. Instead, sections of the political, scientific, and media establishment acted as though admitting doubt would empower extremists. The strategy failed. Suppressing a plausible question did not destroy it. It made every later disclosure look like vindication of the most extreme accusations. It deepened distrust, not only in Fauci, but in public health, journalism, scientific publishing, and government itself. The evidence today still leans towards zoonotic spillover in the judgment of the World Health Organization's independent scientific panel. A laboratory-associated incident, nevertheless, remains plausible because the records needed to evaluate it fully have not been released. Both facts must be allowed to coexist. Fauci's diary does not solve the mystery of COVID-19. It exposes why the mystery became a crisis of trust.